The Critique of the Gotha program is a fairly fascinating work that Marx wrote, and it's notable for two things. First, Marx gives one of his most sustained accounts of what communist society would look like. Marx never, or I should say, Marx rarely discusses what the communist society will look like. And there are reasons for that. Marx thinks we can't really know that much about it. We can kind of talk in vague details about it, but how exactly it will look, we're not going to be able to say because we're too stuck in this capitalistic milieu. In the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx, however, says as much as he ever really does say about what communist society might look like. That's one reason why it's interesting. And one of the things that we'll see is that it picks up on earlier themes from Marx. It picks up on these ideas of, not explicitly, but you can kind of read into the Critique of the Gotha program, which is a late work of Marx's. You can see where some of the earlier works are kind of informing it. Human production, social production, non-alienated labor, and so on, becoming a species being. He never mentions any of those things explicitly, but his vision of communist society would seem to embody a lot of those ideas from his earlier writings. A second reason the Critique of the Gotha program is a noteworthy work is because it's one of the few places in Marx's corpus where he explicitly discusses justice. And so it's worth paying attention to see what he says about justice. And the bit that we're reading, it's all about justice. So the Critique of the Gotha program, why is it called this? Well, the idea is something like this. There was a German Workers' Party, and they were going to adopt a platform for their party in the same way that the Democratic Party or the Republican Party adopt platforms, statements of what they're about and what they want to do. The Communist Party, the Workers' Party in Germany during Marx's time, was going to try to do the similar thing. And they were going to have their meeting, their convention, as we would call it. And they didn't call it a convention back then, but they were going to have their meeting in a town called Gotha. And they sent the program prior to the meeting to Marx to get his feedback. And the Critique of the Gotha program by Marx is just his comments on this party platform, on this program. And what I'm really going to focus on is what Marx has to say about the Gotha program as it relates to fair distributions. So the Gotha program talks about a fair distribution, and that gives Marx an occasion to develop his own thoughts about fair distributions, about just distributions. And what Marx wants to say is that it's not so easy to say what exactly a fair distribution is. And according to Marx, it really depends upon societal circumstances what a fair distribution is. And from this idea, Marx launches into describing two different phases of communist society. So the idea is something like this. As we talked about when we were going over the Communist Manifesto, communist society is going to arise out of a capitalistic society. Marx's idea, kind of famous idea from the Communist Manifesto, is that capitalism produces its own grave diggers, which is to say, the bourgeoisie, being in control of the means of production, produces a revolutionary proletariat. And the proletariat are the gravediggers of capitalism, are the gravediggers of the bourgeoisie. Well, when they dig those graves, so to speak, when the proletariat acquires power, that's going to usher in the first phase of communist society, which Marx calls the dictatorship of the proletariat. And it's communist society immediately or soon after it emerges from capitalism, where the people who are in power in this society, the proletariat, the working class, had grown up under capitalism. They have that baggage. This is the first phase of communist society. It's Marx would also refer to it as the lower phase of communist society. It's kind of imperfect, transitional phase of communist society. The second phase, which we'll talk about, is the higher phase, the more perfect phase, when all of this capitalistic baggage has been washed away or forgotten, right? That'll be the higher phase of communist society. But the first phase, communist society after it emerges from capitalism. Marx says in this phase of communist society, a just distribution, a fair distribution, will be the following. The worker will receive back from society exactly what he gives to it, to each according to his contribution. So however much the worker contributes, that's how much the worker gets back, so to speak. Now you might think, I don't know, how is that any different than capitalism, right? You go work at the factory and then you get a paycheck. Marx would say it's very different. In a capitalist society, workers receive less than they produce. They do not get back what they produce. Recall the example from Capital when we were talking about exploitation, right? In a capitalist society, workers are exploited. And what that exploitation amounts to is that workers receive less than they produce. And so in Marx's example, the worker produces 6 shillings worth of value, right? His labor over the course of the day produces 6 shillings worth of value, but the worker is only paid 3 shillings. And so in a capitalistic society, workers receive less than they produce. In this first phase of communist society, that'll be rectified. Workers will receive what they produce or equal value to what they produce. So in the first phase of communist society, the worker, so to go back to Marx's example in Capital of exploitation, the worker who produces, say, 6 shillings worth of value, the worker who turns 20 pounds of cotton into 20 pounds of yarn, they'll receive 6 shillings worth of value back. Now, Marx is pretty clear, and he describes this in some detail, not a whole lot, but in some. In this first phase of communist society, and in communist society more generally, there's not going to be money. There will be no money. And so the worker is not going to receive a wage. He's not selling his labor as a commodity. This is a feature of capitalism. It's a feature that Marx is hopeful that communist society will abolish, will get rid of, will usher out of the way. And so there's not going to be money. Instead, there will be these certificates, I believe is what they're called in our translation. Sometimes they're called labor vouchers or vouchers. And so the worker will produce, say, will work so much and produce so much value. They'll get a certificate saying they produce this much value. They can then take that certificate to the common store of goods, the goods held in common that are produced by everybody, by society, and then exchange that certificate for an equal amount of goods from the common store. Right? That's Marx's idea. And so a lot of people want to say, well, okay, how is that not money? Isn't that just money by a different name? And not really, because Marx would say, one of the things he would say, these certificates are non-transferable. They can't be exchanged between people. And so there's going to be a major difference between these certificates and money, right? So I can't give you my certificate. You can't give me yours. Why? Well, because the whole point here is to each according to his or her contribution. And so if I just gave you my certificate, you would be getting more than what you contributed, right? And so we're not going to do that. To each according to his contribution, right? This is going to be the first phase of communist society. And Marx is aware, and then this will be just. And you can see how this is, even to us stuck in this capitalistic society that we're in, we can even see how there's something that seems to be kind of intuitively just about this, right? Especially if you buy Marx's account of exploitation, right? You might think, yeah, that does seem kind of weird that, you produce 6 shillings worth of value. You only get 3 shillings in pay. That seems a bit unjust. Well, this first phase of communist society rectifies that, but it's not completely just. And it's not perfect. It's not ideal. And Marx is aware of that. One of the things that Marx would note is that, no notice is taken of what you actually need. A worker who has 5 children to feed versus a worker who just has himself to feed. If they produce the same amount of value, they work equally hard and they're equally skilled and so on, and work equal hours, they'll get exactly the same amount in these certificates. And Marx thinks, or seems to suggest, that there's something a little bit less than ideal about that, but that's the way it's going to work in this first phase of communist society. And his idea seems to be, well, because we still haven't shaken off all this capitalistic baggage yet, there's still this idea of we've kind of got to weed this self-interest out of our systems, out of society gradually. We've done it to a large degree by abolishing bourgeois property, but it's still going to linger. And so what a fair distribution is going to look like, it's going to take that into account, that there's still these remnants of self-interest, of merit, deserving, however much you do, you deserve that much back, right? There's this idea that justice requires something like that. And so this first phase of communist society is going to acknowledge that. And so what justice looks like in this first phase is going to be this: to each according to his contribution, right? Something like that. And we need to take note of this, right? It'd be foolish to expect more, Marx thinks. And it's only once we get to the second phase of communist society, this higher phase, that we can really have a kind of full, ideal version of justice. And it's in describing the justice of this second phase that Marx states one of the most famous claims from Marx's corpus. A fair distribution in this second phase of the second phase of communist society, Marx says, only in this second phase will we be able to, put on our banner, put on our flag, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. That's what a fair distribution is going to look like in this second phase. Doesn't make a very good flag, so I don't know exactly, but I don't know, whatever, right? And so the idea here is that this is what a just distribution will look like in this second phase. And this is going to seem a lot more foreign to us. How exactly is that going to work? How are people going to be satisfied with that? Right? Those are going to be natural questions that we're going to think, but Marx would say, yeah, you're going to think them just because you're still embedded in this capitalistic society. But in this highest phase of communist society, what we're going to find is that people are no longer self-interested. People are no longer looking just out for themselves, looking to make a buck or whatever, right? Working just for the wage. That's not the way it's going to work. Rather, in this higher phase of communist society, Marx doesn't put it in these terms, but I think this is the idea. People are going to be engaging in social production, in non-alienated labor. People will have become species beings, genuinely communal beings, who work not out of their own self-interest, but who work kind of for the sake of the whole, for the sake of the community. And so who engage in social production, who work to objectify their personality and individuality, who find value in that, and who find value simply in making products that satisfy other human needs. That's all the payment they need, right? Making products that satisfy human need. There's no need for a wage. There's no need for a certificate. And so the idea in this higher phase of communist society is that people will work as hard and as skillfully as they are able to. And the products of their work will go to this common store. And then people will draw on that common store as they need to. And so if somebody is very, say, infirm and sick, They might not be able to produce a whole lot. They can still take just as much as they need. That's the idea of this higher phase of communist society, in which people are engaging in social production, in which people have become species beings, in which human emancipation is fully realized. Right? This is Marx's idea. Now, after laying out these two kinds of justice, these two ways, right? So there are different principles of distributive justice. Marx thinks there's no one answer as to what's just. It depends upon your society, the particular circumstances of your society. And so in this second phase of communist society, given the way that society will be structured, this is what a just distribution will look like. Now, after laying out his views on justice, Marx kind of stops and says, "What? But actually, focusing on distributive justice, focusing on justice is misguided. It's kind of beside the point." And this is a theme throughout Marx's writing. He is critical of other socialists who frame their socialism or frame their communism in terms of justice. He thinks that's a misguided emphasis. Justice is not actually all that relevant or important. It's not going to organize the workers. It's not going to spur them to action, focusing on justice. And in fact, Marx seems to even take a somewhat historicist view of justice. What's just in one society is not, or in one epoch, historical epoch, is not what's just in another. And so Marx doesn't think we ought to focus on justice after all. He says these things about justice, but he actually thinks, don't bother. It doesn't matter. What matters then? Focusing on the means of production, the way capitalistic societies work, the fact that capitalistic societies produce more goods than any society, than anyone could have ever dreamed of, basically throughout the history of humanity. There is just an abundance of material wealth now. And yet, people are poor. People are starving. Focus on that. Focus on the fact that workers produce, say, 6 shillings worth of value and are only given 3 shillings in pay. Don't talk about that in terms of justice, Marx would say. What's that going to do? You're just going to get involved in these moral disputes. You're just going to, and no, just focus on that fact. Show that to workers. You don't even need to mention justice. Justice is beside the point. Just show them that. That's enough to spur the revolution, so to speak, Marx would think. That seems to be his idea. And focusing on justice is just a kind of bourgeois preoccupation, right? That's what that's not kind of serious revolutionary activity, and it's not going to seriously address the issue, right? The issue is the mode of production, the fact that we have private ownership of productive property. That's the issue. That's what needs to be addressed. Justice is kind of beside the point. That's Marx's takeaway from the critique of the Gotha program. And so that's why throughout Marx's writings, he doesn't really talk about justice at all. If you go back and read the passage from Capital on exploitation, he doesn't mention justice. Go back and read the stuff on alienation. He doesn't mention justice. He almost never mentions justice. He does not think of his ideas in those terms. And I think that's an important point to understand about Marx. It's an important correction, right? Because often enough, we think of that as the only way to think about political matters. And this is true even of Marxists today. They think the only way to address political matters today is through this lens of justice. Marx himself thought that that was misguided and ineffective, right? And so that's the main takeaway from the critique of the Gotha program, or at least that seems to be the main takeaway that Marx would have us come away with. But we also get this vision of what a communist society will look like. And given our prior readings, we actually even know more than what Marx says in the Critique of the Gotha program. It's going to be human production, become a species being, social production, and so on.